Middle-earth holds more than mountains and rivers. It carries the echoes of forgotten ages. I am your keeper of ancient knowledge, sharing the deeper lore that illuminates even the darkest mysteries. Welcome to the untold stories.
In the deep autumn of the Third Age, when the leaves of Rivendell burned like scattered stars against the darkening sky, there came to the hidden valley a restlessness that even the eldest of the Eldar could not name. It whispered in the turning of the season, in the cold breath that descended from the misty mountains, and in the silence that had begun to settle too heavily upon the world. Elrond Half-elven stood upon the high terrace of his house, his grey eyes fixed upon the road that wound down from the high passes. The last homely house had seen countless ages turn, had weathered the rise and fall of kingdoms, yet now something stirred in the very stones beneath his feet. A tremor not of earth, but of time itself, drawing towards some great confluence. The wind carried more than the scent of dying leaves. There was iron in it, and ash, and the faint echo of hammers that had not rung for many centuries. In the forges below, where once the great smiths of Eregion had wrought marvels of craft and beauty, Elrond felt the ancient fires calling to be rekindled. Not for ornament or display, but for necessity, grim and urgent as the shadow that crept ever closer to the borders of the free lands. "The stars are troubled tonight," came a voice soft as falling snow. Galadriel emerged from the halls behind him, her presence bringing both comfort and a deeper unease. The Lady of Lothlorien rarely came to Rivendell in these days, and her arrival 3 nights past had set the very air to humming with unspoken purpose. "As are we all, my lady," Elrond replied, not turning from his vigil. "The seeing stones grow dim, and even the mirror of your fountain reflects naught but mist and shadow. Something moves in the darkness, something that seeks what was lost and should not be found." She joined him at the terrace's edge, and together they gazed into the gathering dusk. Far to the south, beyond the sight of mortal eyes, the borders of Mordor pressed against the ancient barriers that held them. To the north, the lonely mountains stood sentinel over lands that had known too much sorrow, and between, scattered like seeds upon barren ground, the free peoples of Middle-earth went about their daily toil, unaware that the very foundations of their world trembled. "He will come," Galadriel said, and though she spoke no name, both knew of whom she spoke. "The heir of Isildur walks the wild paths, but his steps lead ever toward this place. The time of choosing draws near." Elrond's hand moved unconsciously to his side, where once the sword Hadafang had hung. But it was not of weapons that he thought now, but of their making, of fire enfolding, of ancient words spoken over cooling steel, and of the price that all great works demand of their makers. "The shards lie still in the treasury," he murmured. "Narsil, that was broken upon the slopes of Mount Doom. For long years they have waited, patient as only the work of dwarfsmiths can be, patient yet not without purpose." A light began to kindle in the lower windows of the house, and the sound of evening songs drifted up from the halls below. But the music seemed strangely muted, as though the very air resisted its passage. In the growing gloom, the 2 lords of the Eldar stood in contemplation of tasks that lay ahead. Tasks that would demand all their ancient wisdom and more. For in the depths of his foresight, Elrond had seen the hour approaching when the broken sword must be made whole again, when the blood of kings would be tested in fire more terrible than any furnace. The shadow in the east stirred, and with it, the need for light to answer darkness. The first section was ending, but already the next chapter of the tale pressed upon them like the weight of coming storm. 3 leagues to the east of Rivendell, where the ancient paths wound through groves of birch and elm that had known the footsteps of the elder days, something moved that was neither wind nor beast. The trees themselves seemed to lean inward, their branches forming a corridor of silver and shadow. and along this natural hallway came a figure that walked with the measured pace of one who has travelled far upon errands that brook no delay. Lindir of the House of Elrond paused in his evening wanderings, his keen ears catching what mortal senses would have missed. The whisper of worn leather against bark, the soft tread of feet that knew well how to pass unmarked through the wild. Yet this was no enemy that approached, for the very forest seemed to part before the walker, and the night birds continued their songs untroubled. Strider comes again to the valley, Lindir murmured to himself, recognizing in the rhythm of those steps the gait of one who had walked these paths since childhood, though his childhood lay now in the distant past. The ranger moved like water flowing over stone, inevitable and sure, yet bearing with him something new, a weight that had not been upon his shoulders when last he passed this way. The elf lord made his way swiftly back toward the house, but not before catching sight of the traveller as he emerged from the deeper woods. Tall he was, and grim of face, his grey cloak travel-stained and his hood drawn up against the evening chill. Yet it was not the wear of the road that marked him, but something deeper, a shadow of purpose that hung about him like a mantle, and in his eyes a light that spoke of visions both terrible and necessary. Behind him, though he walked alone, it seemed as though the very trees bore witness to his passage. In their rustling leaves could be heard the echo of older voices, the Entwives who had vanished from memory, the tree shepherds who had once walked openly in the world, and deeper still, the voices of those who had sung the forest into being when the world was young. All these seemed to whisper of changes coming, of the turning of a page in the great book of days. By the time Aragorn, son of Arathorn, reached the ford of Brunnen, word of his approach had already reached the halls above. Elrond stood waiting in the courtyard, his face grave but not unwelcoming. Between the Lord of Rivendell and the ranger who approached passed a look of understanding that needed no words, for both had felt the tremor in the foundations of the world, and both knew that the hour of decision drew near like the tide returning to a long, empty shore. Esgaroth has fallen to shadow. Aragorn spoke without preamble as he crossed the threshold. His voice carried the weariness of one who has seen too much. Yet beneath it ran a current of steel that had not been there in younger years. The master is dead, and strange lights dance above the long lake. The people flee southward, speaking of a darkness that rises from the water itself. Elrond received this news with the stillness of stone, though his eyes kindled with a light both bright and terrible. In the distance thunder rumbled, though no clouds marred the star-filled sky, and somewhere in the deep places of the earth, ancient fires stirred as though called by the words that had just been spoken. "Come," said Elrond at last. "There are things we must speak of, and choices that can no longer be delayed. The shards of Narsil have dreamed restless dreams of late, and I begin to think their time of waking draws near." Through the halls of memory Aragorn walked, though his feet trod the familiar stones of Rivendell. Each step echoed with the weight of years uncounted. Years spent in the wild places, years of watching and waiting, of small battles fought in forgotten corners, where only the wind bore witness to deeds that would never be sung in the halls of men. Elrond led him not to the great hall where councils were held, but to a smaller chamber deep within the house, where firelight danced upon walls lined with books and scrolls that held the wisdom of ages. Here, in this place of quiet contemplation, the heaviest words were often spoken, and the most fateful decisions made. "Tell me of your road," Elrond said simply, settling into a chair carved from a single piece of mallen wood. "Tell me what you have seen in the lands beyond our borders, for your eyes hold shadows that were not there when last you departed." Aragorn remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed into the fire. In its dancing flames he saw again the scenes that had brought him here with such urgency, the dead lying unburied along the shores of the long lake, the boats foundering in waters that had turned black as oil, the the children crying for parents who would not wake from their endless sleep. I have ridden from Dale to Esgaroth, from the slopes of Erebor to the borders of the Brown Lands, he began, his voice low and measured. Everywhere I have found the same tale, darkness spreading like a plague, hope dying in the hearts of men, and in their eyes the look of those who know that winter has come and will not end. He turned from the fire then, and in his grey eyes, Elrond saw reflected the same burden that he himself had carried for so many centuries. The weight of foresight, of seeing clearly what others refused to acknowledge, of bearing knowledge that was both gift and curse. The Easterlings grow bold, Aragorn continued. They press closer to the borders of Rhovanion, and their banners bear signs that were old when Númenor was young. I have seen their encampments, heard their war songs echoing across the plains. They speak of a king returning, of promises made in the darkness that will soon be fulfilled. And yet you have come here, Elrond observed, rather than riding to Minas Tirith to warn the steward. Why? The question hung in the air between them like an unsheathed blade. Aragorn was silent for a long moment, and in that silence lay the heart of all his wandering, all his years of exile and hidden kingship. When he spoke again, his words came slow and deliberate, as though each one was drawn from some deep well within his soul. Because I have walked in the wild for 70 years, and I have learned that there are times when a man must choose not what is expected of him, but what is necessary. Denethor would hear my warnings as the words of a ranger, nothing more. His pride runs too deep to accept counsel from one he deems a wanderer without station or authority. He paused, his gaze returning to the fire. But there are others who know me for what I am, who remember the oath sworn in ages past and the blood that flows in my veins. It is to these I come, not as Strider of the Wild, but as Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur. Elrond nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like water finding its course. You speak of necessity. What necessity drives you here, to this house where your childhood was spent and your manhood forged? The necessity of steel, Aragorn replied without hesitation. The necessity of binding up that which was broken, of making whole that which has lain in fragments too long. The enemy stirs, my lord, and when he rises in his full strength, it will not be enough to stand against him with hope alone. Outside, the wind had risen, and it carried with it the sound of distant thunder. In the depths of the house, in chambers where few were permitted to go, ancient things stirred in their resting places, as though they too sensed that the hour of their awakening drew near. The morning came grey and cold to Rivendell, shrouded in mist that rose from the river, but seemed reluctant to lift, even as the sun climbed higher. From the high tower of Elrond's house, where the seeing stone of the north had once gazed upon distant lands, the view stretched eastward across league upon league of wilderness, toward the dark line of Mirkwood. Gandalf the Grey stood at the window, his weathered hands gripping the stone sill, his eyes fixed upon something that mortal sight could not discern. He had arrived before dawn, his horse, Shadowfax, bearing him swiftly from the borders of Fangorn, and upon his brow lay the shadow of knowledge that no bearer of one of the three should possess. You see it too, said Elrond, joining him at the window. It was not a question, for the wizard's bearing spoke plainly of visions that brought no comfort, of sight that pierced too deeply into the gathering dark. I see the hill where Dol Guldur stands, Gandalf replied, his voice heavy with foreboding. I see the shadow that spreads from its broken walls like ink upon parchment, and I see something more, a stirring in the deep places, a waking that should not be. Far to the east, beyond the reach of any eye save those blessed or cursed with the sight of the Eldar, the ruins of the necromancer's stronghold rose like a canker upon the southern edge of the great forest. Though the Nazgul had been driven forth, and the fortress broken by the might of the White Council, still something lingered there, something that fed upon the darkness and grew stronger with each passing season. The Nazgul may have departed, Gandalf continued, but their master's influence remains. The very stones of that accursed place remember the touch of his will, and through them he reaches still, seeking what was lost to him in the deeps of time. Elrond's face grew grave as understanding dawned. You speak of the lost rings, the 7 and the 9 that were given to dwarf lords and the kings of men. Some were consumed by dragonfire, others reclaimed by their maker, but not all their fates are known. Not all, Gandalf agreed, and it is the uncertainty that troubles my sleep. In Dol Guldur, I felt the echo of searching, the sense of one who gropes in darkness for something precious that lies just beyond his grasp. What if one of the 7 yet lies hidden in the halls beneath Erebor? What if the awakening of the dragon was no mere chance, but part of a design darker and more subtle than we knew? The wizard turned from the window then, and in his eyes burned a light that was both terrible and urgent. Smaug is dead, and the Mountain Kingdom restored, but the treasure chambers of Erebor hold more than gold and gems. They hold memories worked in mithril and steel, artifacts of power that were hidden away when the dragon came. If the enemy suspects what lies there, then he will move against the mountain before the year is out, Elrond finished, and Dain Ironfoot, for all his courage, cannot stand against the might that even now gathers in the east. A silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of possibilities too dark to speak aloud. In that silence, both could hear the distant sound of hammers ringing in the forges below. Not the gentle craftwork of peaceful days, but the urgent rhythm of weapons being prepared, of armor being mended, of a household making ready for war. There is more, Gandalf said at last. In my wanderings near the borders of Mordor, I have felt a presence that was not there before, ancient and patient, yet stirring now to wakefulness. The mouth of Sauron speaks with greater authority than ever he did in years past, and the orcs of the Misty Mountains move with purpose that speaks of unified command. The hour grows late, Elrond murmured, and still the greatest weapon lies broken in our treasury, waiting for the one with both the right and the will to claim it. As if summoned by his words, a knock came upon the chamber door. Aragorn entered, his travel stains washed away, but his face still bearing the marks of the dark tidings he had brought. In the morning light, the resemblance to his ancestor was clear. The proud bearing, the grey eyes that seemed to hold depths of starlight, the hands that were made to wield a king's sword. The shards, he said simply. I would see them. Deep beneath the house of Elrond, where the roots of the mountains themselves formed the foundation stones, lay chambers that had been carved in the elder days, when Gil-galad was king, and the power of the elves in Middle-earth stood at its height. Here, in vaults lined with mithril and warded with songs of power, were kept the treasures and artifacts that had survived the wreck of kingdoms and the passage of ages. The way led down through corridors lit by crystals that caught and held the light of distant stars, past galleries where the history of the elder days was graven in living stone. Elrond walked first, bearing a lamp whose flame burned white and cold, followed by Gandalf with his staff gleaming like a shard of lightning. And last came Aragorn, his footsteps echoing in the profound silence, like the beat of a heart in the darkness. No word was spoken as they descended, for this was a place where words seemed too small to contain the weight of memory that pressed upon the very air. Here walked the shades of those who had fallen at the last alliance, the echo of horns that had sounded upon the slopes of Mount Doom, the whisper of oaths sworn in the darkness before the gates of Barad-dûr. At length, they came to a door wrought of black steel and silver, upon which were carved the emblems of Gondor and Arnor, as they had been in the days of their glory. No lock barred their way, yet the door opened only to Elrond's touch. recognizing in him the authority of one who had stood witness to the making of the very thing that lay beyond. The chamber within was circular, its walls rising up into darkness that seemed to swallow even the light of Elrond's lamp. In the center, upon a pillar of white stone, lay the shards of Narsil, wrapped in cloth that had been woven in Lothlorien when the world was young. Even broken as they were, something of the sword's ancient power remained, for the very air around them seemed to thrum with barely contained force. Aragorn approached slowly, his breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. With each step, the weight of his bloodline pressed upon him more heavily. The knowledge that he was at the last of a line that stretched back through the mists of time to the shores of Numenor itself, to kings who had walked with the Valar and spoken with the voices of the sea. "Behold Narsil," Elrond said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Flame of the West, forged in the fires of the First Age when the craft of the Noldor burned bright in Middle-earth. With this blade, Gil-galad and Elendil stood against the Dark Lord upon the slopes of Mount Doom, and with it Isildur cut the ring from Sauron's hand." The cloth fell away at Elrond's touch, revealing fragments of steel that seemed to drink in the light and give it back transformed. The blade had been broken near the hilt, leaving only a hand's length of metal attached to the grip, while the rest lay in pieces of varying size, their edges still sharp enough to cut stone. Yet even in their broken state, the shards sang with an inner fire. Along the fuller of the blade, letters could still be seen etched in the ancient script of Westernesse, Telchar's mark, who had forged the steel in the deeps of time, and beneath it the name that would ring again when the sword was made whole: Andúril, Flame of the West. Gandalf leaned upon his staff, his eyes reflecting the cold fire of the shards. 67 years they have lain here, he murmured. 67 years since the last alliance ended and the sword was broken. Yet still they wait, patient as only the work of mastersmiths can be, for the hand that will lift them again in the final darkness. Aragorn reached out, then hesitated, his hand trembling slightly. To touch the shards would be to accept fully what he had always known, but never truly embraced, that he was not merely Strider the Ranger, wanderer of the wild ways, but Aragorn's son of Arathorn, rightful king of Gondor, and Arnor, heir of Isildur the Tall. "I am afraid," he said at last, the words torn from him like confession. "As you should be," Elrond replied gently, "for this choice, once made, cannot be undone. To take up the sword of your fathers is to take up their burden as well, the responsibility for all the free peoples of Middle-earth, the weight of decisions that will echo through all the years to come." In the silence that followed, only the distant sound of water could be heard, trickling somewhere in the depths of the mountain like the tears of the earth itself. As Aragorn's fingers closed at last upon the larger shard of Narsil, the world around him dissolved into shadow and flame. The vault, Elrond, Gandalf, all fell away like mist before the wind, and in their place rose visions that burned themselves into his mind with the clarity of lived memory. He stood upon the slopes of Mount Doom, but not as himself. He was Isildur, the king his ancestor, and in his hand blazed the full length of Narsil, its flame cutting through the darkness like a star brought down to earth. Before him towered the Dark Lord himself, terrible in his wrath, the ring of power gleaming upon his finger like a captive sun. "Take it," whispered a voice that was his own, yet not his own. "Take it and end this forever." But even as the blade fell and the ring was severed from Sauron's hand, Aragorn felt the weight of temptation that had been Isildur's doom. The golden circle lay upon the rocky ground, and from it emanated such power, such promise of dominion over all the free peoples of Middle-earth. To claim it would be to become a king indeed, not merely of Gondor and Arnor, but of all the lands from the Grey Havens to the Sea of Rune. I cannot. He heard his ancestor's voice, thick with longing and terror. I cannot destroy it. It is too beautiful, too powerful. It is mine by right of conquest, mine by the blood I have shed to claim it. The vision shifted, and now Aragorn walked through the halls of Minas Tirith as they had been in the days of the kings, bright with banners, filled with the laughter of children, alive with the music of a people who knew not fear. But even in this glory, he felt the weight of the ring upon his finger, felt how it slowly consumed the very light it seemed to kindle, turning gold to ash and hope to despair. Years passed in moments, and he saw how the ring's influence spread like a poison through all his works. The kingdom that should have been a beacon of peace became a tyranny of iron will. The subjects who should have loved him learned instead to fear his coming. The blade that had been forged to protect the innocent became a tool of oppression, wielded by a king who had forgotten. That power over others was the cruelest slavery of all. "This is the truth they never speak," said Isildur's voice, now hollow with the weight of ages. "This is why I could not cast it into the fire, not from weakness but from foresight. I saw what would come to pass if ever the ring found its way back to its master, but I saw too what would happen if I claimed it for my own. In the end, I chose the lesser evil, to hide it away, to let it sleep in darkness rather than wake to serve either shadow or light." The vision darkened, and Aragorn found himself standing not in the glory of Minas Tirith, but in the Gladden fields, where the waters ran red with blood, and the air was thick with the cries of the dying. Here Isildur had met his end, struck down by orc arrows, as he tried to escape the consequences of his choice. Here the ring had slipped from his finger and vanished into the waters, beginning its long wait for a finder who would prove either its redemption or its doom. "Do you understand now, my son?" Isildur's shade seemed to stand before him, his face worn with sorrow and the weight of uncounted years. "Do you see why the sword was broken? Why it has lain in pieces all these years? It is not enough to forge it anew. You must be certain, absolutely certain, that you can wield it without falling to the same pride that was my undoing." "But the ring is lost," Aragorn whispered. "It sleeps in the waters of Anduin, far from the reach of any who would claim it." "Is it?" The shade's eyes seemed to pierce through him like arrows of ice. "Are you so certain? For I tell you truly, my descendant, that the ring was made to be found. It will not rest forever in the depths, content to be forgotten. Even now it stirs, calling to those who have the will to answer, and when it wakes, the whole world will feel it stirring." The vision began to fade, but Isildur's final words echoed in the darkness like a prophecy. "When that hour comes, the sword must be ready. But more than that, the man who bears it must be stronger than I was. He must be prepared to do what I could not, to choose the harder path, to accept that some victories can only be won through sacrifice of the very thing one fights to protect." Aragorn gasped and found himself back in the vault, his hand still gripping the shard of Narsil. But now he understood why it had remained broken for so long, not from any lack of skill in the forges of Rivendell, but because the sword itself had been waiting for one who could bear not just its weight, but the weight of the choice that would inevitably come with it. In the moment of Aragorn's awakening from the vision, something else stirred in the depths of Middle-earth. Far to the east, in the ruins of Dol Guldur, where shadow pooled thick as oil between the broken stones, a presence that had lain dormant suddenly lifted its awareness like a hound catching a scent upon the wind. The touch of Isildur's air upon the shards of Narsil had not gone unnoticed. Across the leagues and through the barriers, both seen and unseen, the Dark Lord's will reached out, questing, searching for the source of the disturbance that had rippled through the very foundations of the world. "So," came a voice like the whisper of dying leaves, like the sound of hope crumbling to ash. The broken sword dreams of being whole again. The lost king remembers his name. In the vault beneath Rivendell, Gandalf suddenly stiffened, his grip tightening upon his staff until his knuckles showed white. Elrond too felt it, a touch upon the borders of their sanctuary, cold and questing, seeking a way through the ancient wards that protected the hidden valley. "He knows," Gandalf whispered, his voice tight with strain as he bent his will to strengthening the defenses. "The enemy knows that the heir of Isildur has come at last to claim his inheritance." The temperature in the vault plummeted until their breath came in visible clouds, and frost began to form upon the walls, despite the deep location beneath the earth. The very stones seemed to shrink away from some invisible presence, and the light of Elrond's lamp flickered as though a great wind sought to extinguish it. "Yes, I know you, son of Arathorn," the voice continued, seeming to come from the air itself, from the shadows that danced at the edges of their vision. "I know your line, your hopes, your fears. Did you think to hide from me forever in the wild places? Did you think the scattered remnants of Numenor's glory could stand against the tide that rises in the east?" Aragorn felt the words like physical blows, each one striking at the deepest uncertainties that had plagued him through all his years of exile. The voice spoke of his failures as a leader, of the lives lost under his guidance, of the kingdoms that had fallen while he wandered in self-imposed exile, rather than claiming the throne that was his by right. "You are weak, as all your line has been weak since Isildur first betrayed his trust. You speak of forging the sword anew, but what use is steel in the hands of one who lacks the will to wield it? What use is a crown to one who fears to wear it?" But even as the voice sought to break his spirit, Aragorn felt something else, a warmth spreading from the shard in his hand, a strength that came not from his own will, but from the blade itself. The sword of his fathers had tasted the blood of orcs and men, had stood against the Dark Lord upon the slopes of Mount Doom, and it would not be cowed by mere words, however terrible their source. "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn," he said aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I am the heir of Isildur, chieftain of the Dunedain and rightful king of Gondor and Arnor. You know me, Shadow, as I know you, servant of darkness, enemy of all free peoples, the nameless one who has forgotten that even the mightiest can fall." A sound like thunder rolling through vast caverns echoed in the vault, but whether it was laughter or rage, none could say. The presence pressed closer, and for a moment it seemed as though the very walls might crack under the weight of its malice. Brave words from one who cowers in hidden valleys while his people suffer and die. But words are wind, son of kings, and winter is coming that will freeze the breath in your throat. When the hour of trial comes, and it comes soon, we shall see whether your blade cuts deeper than your fear. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the presence withdrew, leaving behind only the fading echo of malevolent laughter and the memory of eyes like burning coals that had looked upon them and found them wanting. In the silence that followed, Elrond slowly lowered his hands from where he had been weaving protective spells, his face pale but resolute. "He has grown stronger than I feared," the Elf Lord said quietly. "His reach extends farther, his voice carries deeper. The time of hiding is nearly over." Gandalf nodded grimly. "The die is cast whether we will it or not. The enemy has marked you now, Aragorn, as surely as if you had proclaimed yourself from the citadel of Minas Tirith. There can be no more delay, no more hesitation. The sword must be reforged, and quickly, before his servants come seeking the one who dared to wake it from its slumber." The ascent from the vault seemed to take an age, though in truth they climbed swiftly through the winding passages. Behind them, the shadows pressed close as if seeking to follow, and more than once Gandalf paused to speak words of warding that blazed briefly in the air before fading into the stone. When at last they emerged into the upper halls of the house, they found Rivendell transformed. Where before had been the peaceful bustle of evening preparations, now there was the ordered haste of a stronghold preparing for siege. Elves moved through the corridors with weapons in their hands, and from the high towers came the sound of horns calling across the valley, not in welcome, but in warning. Galadriel? Elrond asked of Lindir, who approached them with urgent steps. She awaits in the Hall of Fire, my lord, along with the others of the White Council who have answered the call. Cárdan has come from the Grey Havens, and Glorfindel has ridden in from the borders of Eriador. All have felt the stirring in the darkness. They made their way through halls that seemed to thrum with barely contained power. The very air crackled with the presence of the three rings, for their bearers had gathered in one place for the first time since the forming of the White Council. As they approached the Hall of Fire, Aragorn could hear voices raised not in song, but in discourse, the measured cadences of those who had lived through ages and seen kingdoms rise and fall like waves upon the shore. The Hall of Fire was the heart of Rivendell, where the great hearth burned with flames that never died and had warmed the hands of heroes whose names were legend. Tonight, those flames burned higher and brighter than ever before, as though they too sensed the gravity of the hour. Around the fire sat the mighty of the elder days. Galadriel, Lady of Light, her hair catching and holding the firelight like spun gold. Círdan the shipwright, eldest of the elves who remained in Middle-earth, his beard white as foam upon the shore. Glorfindel, who had walked in the light of the two trees and returned from death itself to serve the cause of the free peoples. And standing before the fire, his staff planted upon the floor and his grey robes rippling in the heat of the flames, was Gandalf, but not as Aragorn had ever seen him before. Gone was the old wanderer's humble bearing, the gentle humour that usually danced in his eyes. In their place stood one of the Astari in his full power, and the light that blazed from him was not the warm glow of hearthfire, but the terrible radiance of lightning barely contained. "The time of secrecy is ended," Gandalf declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "The enemy has shown his hand, has reached across the leagues to touch our very sanctuary. He knows of the sword, knows of the heir who has come to claim it. Even now his servants begin to stir. I can feel them moving in the darkness like wolves closing in upon their prey." As if summoned by his words, a shadow fell across the hall despite the blazing fire. The temperature dropped and frost began to form upon the windows. From somewhere far off came the sound of wings, great wings beating against the wind, and with them a cry that chilled the blood of all who heard it. "Nazgul," breathed Glorfindel, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of his sword. But Gandalf raised his staff, and from its tip blazed forth a light so brilliant that it seemed to pierce through the very walls of the house. "Not while I stand," he said, and his voice carried the authority of one who had walked in the presence of the Valar themselves. "Not while the flame of Anor burns in this staff, and not while the three remain to guard the peace of this valley." The light spread outward from the wizard like ripples on a pond, washing over the walls and towers of Rivendell, forming a barrier of radiance that no servant of the shadow could pass. The cries of the flying creatures grew distant and frustrated, and after a time faded altogether as they retreated to the darkness from whence they came. But the effort cost him dearly. When the light faded, Gandalf swayed upon his feet, and only Elrond's swift support kept him from falling. In the sudden dimness, he seemed older, more worn, as though the confrontation had aged him by years in moments. "This is but the beginning," he said softly, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I have turned them aside for now, but they will return with greater force. The time for hiding is over, and the time for action has come. The sword must be forged anew, and the king must take up his crown, or all that we have fought to preserve will be lost in the darkness that comes." Galadriel rose from her seat. her presence bringing a measure of peace to the troubled hall. "Then, let it be done," she said simply. "Let the fires be kindled and the anvils ring. Let the broken blade be made whole, and let those who would stand against the darkness take up their appointed tasks. For I tell you all, the hour is later than we knew, and the enemy's strength grows with each passing day." In the hours that followed, when the immediate threat had passed and the wards of Rivendell stood strong once more, the White Council convened in earnest. They gathered not in the Hall of Fire, where the flames still leaped high with residual power, but in Elrond's private study, a chamber lined with maps and charts that showed the movements of armies and the disposition of kingdoms across all of Middle-earth. The talk was long and often contentious, for each member of the council brought with them the wisdom of ages, and the wisdom they had learned did not always speak with one voice. "You move too hastily," said Círdan, his ancient eyes reflecting the weight of countless years. "To forge Andúril now, in haste and desperation, may be to create a weapon flawed from its very making. Better to wait, to prepare properly, to ensure that what we make will endure the trials that lie ahead." "Wait for what?" Gandalf replied, his voice still rough from his earlier exertions. "Wait for the enemy to gather his full strength. Wait for the realms of men to fall one by one, while we debate the finer points of swordcraft. The Nazgûl that came tonight were but scouts. The next time they come, it will be with the full force of Mordor behind them." Glorfindel leaned forward in his chair, his warrior's instincts warring with the caution of one who had seen the cost of hasty action. "The wizard speaks truth about the urgency of our situation. Yet Círdan is not wrong to counsel patience. A blade forged in haste may shatter at the moment of greatest need. We must find a middle path, swift action, but not reckless haste." "And what of the one who must wield the blade?" asked Galadriel, her gaze turning to Aragorn, who had remained silent through much of the debate. "A sword is only as strong as the hand that bears it, and the heart that guides that hand. Are you prepared, son of Arathorn, for what acceptance of your inheritance truly means?" All eyes turned to him then, and Aragorn felt the weight of their combined regard like a physical force. These were the mightiest of the Eldar, beings who had walked with the Valar in the light of the two trees, who had seen the rise and fall of Númenor, who had stood against Morgoth himself in the wars of the Elder Days. What was he, a mortal man with fewer than 90 years to his name, to speak among such as these? Yet speak he must, for the question demanded an answer, and upon that answer might hang the fate of all the free peoples of Middle-earth. "I am prepared to fail," he said at last, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the stillness of the chamber. "I am prepared to fall, as my ancestor fell at the Gladden Fields. I am prepared to make choices that will haunt me through all the years of my life, should I be fortunate enough to survive them. What I am not prepared to do is stand idle while the darkness spreads and good folk suffer for want of a king." Elrond nodded slowly. "It is a hard truth you speak. Yet there is wisdom in acknowledging one's fears. For a king who knows his own limitations is less likely to exceed them than one who believes himself invincible." "But will the people follow him?" Círdan asked bluntly. "It is one thing to claim the throne of Gondor, another entirely to hold it. Denethor has ruled as steward for many years, and his pride runs deep. He will not step aside gladly for one he has never acknowledged as his superior. And the people, will they accept a king who comes to them from the wild, bearing a crown they have not seen for centuries?" "They will follow him if he proves worthy," Galadriel said firmly, "and if the sword in his hand burns with the fire of his ancestors. But first, that sword must be forged, and forged well. This is no task for haste, yet neither can we afford delay." Gandalf stood suddenly, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. "Then let us combine urgency with wisdom. The forging cannot wait, but neither must it be done carelessly. I propose that we begin the work at once, but with all the care and craft that the blade deserves. Let the smiths of Rivendell work through the days and nights. Let the fires burn without ceasing, and let us all lend what power we may to the making. A blade forged by the White Council, mused Glorfindel. It would be a weapon indeed, to be wrought by the combined will of the three ring-bearers and the servant of the secret fire. Yet still, Círdan warned, the greatest care must be taken. We are not merely remaking a sword, we are forging the symbol of a kingdom's hope, the embodiment of a bloodline's destiny. Such a work cannot be undone if it goes awry. Then we shall not let it go awry, Elrond said with finality. Come the dawn, the forges will be lit, and the work will begin. But tonight, let us prepare ourselves in spirit as well as in craft. For what we attempt will test not only our skill, but our resolve. Outside, the wind had risen again, carrying with it the scent of distant fires and the sound of armies on the march. The time of choosing had come at last, and in the morning, the anvils would ring with the birth of Andúril, Flame of the West. While the forges of Rivendell were being prepared for their greatest work in many centuries, Gandalf the Grey took counsel with himself in the quiet hours before dawn. He walked alone upon the high terrace where he had stood with Elrond in the gathering dusk. But now his mind was not upon the darkness that pressed against their borders, but upon the scattered flames of hope that still burned in the wild places of the world. The reforging of Andúril would be but the first step in a longer and more perilous journey. A sword, however fine its making, could not by itself turn the tide of war that was to come. For that, they would need allies, old alliances reforged as surely as broken steel, ancient oaths remembered and honored once more. His thoughts turned first to the north, to the halls beneath the lonely mountain where Dain Ironfoot ruled as king under the mountain. The dwarves of Erebor had proven their valor in the Battle of Five Armies, and their axes had tasted orc blood enough to know that the threat was real and growing. Yet Dain was proud, as all dwarf kings were proud, and he would not easily be swayed to march from his mountain stronghold to aid the realms of men. But there were ways, Gandalf reflected, and words that could be spoken to stir the memory of older debts and deeper loyalties. The dwarves owed much to the company of Thorin Oakenshield, and through them to one small hobbit, whose courage had proven greater than the greed of dragons. If that same hobbit could be persuaded to carry word to Erebor, to speak as one who had walked the secret ways and earned the right to counsel kings. The wizard's staff gleamed softly in the pre-dawn darkness as he reached out with his will, sending his thoughts across the leagues to the borders of the Shire. There, in a hole in the ground that was far more than it seemed, lived a creature who had once walked into the heart of a dragon's lair and emerged with both treasure and wisdom. Bilbo Baggins had grown quiet in his later years, content with his books and his writing, but the fire that had driven him to adventure still smoldered beneath the surface. "Old friend," Gandalf whispered to the wind, letting his voice carry on currents that no mortal sense could perceive. "The time has come again for the unlikely to play their part. The road goes ever on, and there are yet deeds to be done before the final darkness falls." Far to the west, in the comfort of Bag End, Bilbo Baggins stirred in his sleep and dreamed of mountains and golden halls, of the song of steel on steel and the stamp of marching feet. When he woke, he would find himself thinking of old friends and older promises, and perhaps, just perhaps, he would remember that some treasures were worth more than all the gold in Erebor. But the dwarves were not the only allies that might be stirred to action. In the deep places of Fangorn, where the trees remembered the elder days and the Ents walked slow paths between the shadows, there dwelt those who had their own grievances against the servants of darkness. Saruman the White had grown careless in his ambition, and his orcs had felled too many trees, had shown too little respect for the growing things that were the Ents' special charge. Gandalf smiled grimly in the darkness. Let the wizard of Isengard think himself safe behind his walls of stone and steel. He had forgotten, in his pride, that the earth itself might rise against him, that the very trees he had cut down in his greed for industry might have kin who remembered every falling leaf, every severed root. And beyond even these ancient powers, there were others who might be roused to action. The eagles of the Misty Mountains, who owed debts to both wizard and dwarf. The elves of the Woodland Realm, who had already felt the touch of shadow upon their borders and knew that their choice lay between fighting now or facing extinction later. Even among men, there were those who remembered the old alliances, the Rohirrim, the Beornings, the scattered rangers of the north, who served a king they had never seen, but whose authority they acknowledged nonetheless. All of these would have their part to play in the war that was to come. But first, the symbol around which they could rally must be made ready. The sword must be forged, the king must accept his crown, and then the gathering of the hosts could begin in earnest. As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern peaks of the Misty Mountains, Gandalf made his way down from the terrace to the forges below. Already the smiths were at work, heating the ancient furnaces to temperatures that would make the very stones glow like stars. The air thrummed with purpose and power, and in that thrumming the wizard heard the echo of hammers that would soon ring out across all the world. Not in the making of war, but in the forging of hope itself. In the green heart of the Shire, where the river water wound its lazy way between banks lined with willows and meadow-sweet, the world still turned to the gentle rhythm it had known for countless generations. Here, in a land unmarked by the great events that shaped the fate of kingdoms, the hobbits of the Four Farthings went about their daily business with the cheerful ignorance that was perhaps their greatest blessing. Yet in the smile called Bag End, which stood beneath the hill overlooking Hobbiton, like a contented cat basking in the morning sun, stirred one who had once walked in darker places and seen wonders that would have turned the hair of his neighbours white with terror. Bilbo Baggins woke from dreams of fire and steel to find his comfortable parlour filled with the golden light of dawn, but the visions that had visited his sleep lingered like the taste of wine upon his lips. Dragons, he murmured to himself, sitting up in his feather bed and reaching for the silk dressing gown that hung upon the bedpost. Why am I dreaming of dragons again? Smaug has been dead these 60 years and more, and good riddance to him. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were not quite true. It was not Smaug who had stalked through his dreams, breathing fire and malice in equal measure. This had been something older, more terrible. A shadow of wings and flame that spoke with a voice like the whisper of dying hope. In his dream, he had stood again in the treasure chamber beneath the mountain, but the gold that surrounded him had turned to ash at the dragon's breath, and the mithril coat that had once protected him hung in tatters from his shoulders. With the peculiar certainty that sometimes comes to those who have walked strange roads and seen things that mortals were not meant to see, Bilbo knew that his dream had been more than mere fancy. Somewhere in the world beyond the borders of the Shire, events were stirring that would touch even this quiet corner of Middle-earth before they were done. He rose and padded to the window, drawing back the green curtains to look out upon a view that had scarcely changed since his return from adventure all those years ago. The garden was neat and well tended, the hedges trimmed with mathematical precision, and the gate stood firmly closed against any who might seek to disturb his peace. Yet for all its familiar comfort, something seemed different this morning. A quality to the light, perhaps, or a tension in the air that spoke of distant storms gathering. Well, well, he said to himself, a hint of his old adventuring spirit creeping into his voice. It seems the world has not quite finished with old Bilbo Baggins after all. He dressed carefully, choosing his best waistcoat and his favourite walking stick, for he had the sudden certainty that this day would bring visitors. visitors who would remind him of roads not taken, and choices that could no longer be delayed. As he puttered about his kitchen, preparing a breakfast that was rather more elaborate than usual, he found himself humming an old song that he had learned in the halls of the Elven King, long ago when his hair was still brown and his feet had never known the ache of too many miles. Roads go ever, ever on, over rock and under tree, by caves where never sun has shone, by streams that never find the sea. The words came back to him as easily as breathing, though he had not sung them in years. They spoke of journeys and destinations, of paths that led away from comfort and safety toward destinations unknown. Once, they had filled him with dread. Now, to his surprise, they filled him with something very much like longing. Outside, the birds were singing with unusual vigor, and even the flowers in his garden seemed to bend their heads toward the east, as though they too sensed that change was coming on the wind. In the distance, he could hear the voices of his neighbors going about their morning task, watering gardens, feeding chickens, discussing the weather with the grave solemnity that hobbits brought to all such weighty matters. How peaceful it all was, how wonderfully ordinary. Yet Bilbo found himself thinking not of the comfort that surrounded him, but of the weight of Mithril upon his shoulders, of the friendship of dwarves, of the terrible beauty of dragonfire seen from too close a distance. He thought of choices made in darkness, of small acts of courage that had changed the fate of kingdoms, and of the curious way that the most unlikely people could find themselves at the center of the most extraordinary events. "I wonder," he said aloud, setting down his teacup with a decisive click, "I do wonder if I shall have visitors today. It has been far too long since anyone interesting came calling at Bag End." As if summoned by his words, there came a knock upon his round green door. 3 knocks, neither too loud nor too soft, but carrying with them a quality of authority that made the very walls of Bag End seem to lean forward in anticipation. The visitor at Bilbo's door was not Gandalf himself, as the old hobbit had half expected, but rather a dwarf of impressive bearing whose beard was streaked with silver and whose eyes held the keen light of one accustomed to looking into the deep places of the earth. He bore the tokens of Erebor, a pin wrought in the likeness of the Lonely Mountain, and a staff topped with the raven of Durin's house. Balin, son of Fundin, the dwarf introduced himself with a formal bow. "Counselor to Dain Ironfoot, King under the mountain. I bring greetings from the halls of Erebor, and a message that cannot be spoken in the open air." Bilbo received his guest with all the courtesy that hobbit hospitality demanded, but his eyes were bright with curiosity as he led the dwarf into his parlor. It had been many years since any representative of the mountain had come calling at Bag End, and he sensed that this visit bore news of more than common interest. "You are most welcome, Master Balin," he said, settling his guest in the most comfortable chair and bustling about to provide tea and seed cake. "Though I confess myself surprised to see you so far from your mountain halls. What brings a counsellor of King Dain to the Shire?" Balin accepted the refreshments with grave courtesy, but his manner remained formal, almost ceremonial. From within his robes he drew forth a scroll sealed with the mark of Erebor, its parchment yellowed with age and its edges worn smooth by much handling. "I bring word from the king under the mountain," he said, "and also from one who has long been a friend to both dwarf and hobbit. Gandalf the Grey has sent word to Erebor, speaking of stirrings in the dark places and of the need for old alliances to be renewed. He has asked that this be brought to your attention." The scroll bore not only Dain's seal, but also the rune mark that Gandalf had long used in his correspondence with those who shared his knowledge of hidden things. As Bilbo broke the wax and unrolled the parchment, he found himself looking not at words written in the common tongue, but at a map drawn with the careful precision that only dwarf cartographers could achieve. It showed the lands between Erebor and the Grey Havens, but marked upon it were signs and symbols that spoke of more than mere geography. Here were marked the movements of armies in the east, there the gathering places of those who served the darkness. Lines of red ink showed the advance of shadow, while points of gold marked the strongholds of the free peoples that still stood firm against the tide. The king under the mountain has felt the stirring of evil in the deep places, Balin explained as Bilbo studied the map. Our miners speak of sounds that echo in the depths, the ring of iron on stone where no dwarf has delved, the whisper of voices in tongues that were old when Durin first walked beneath the stars. Something stirs in the roots of the mountains, Master Baggins, something that has slept long, but now begins to wake. Bilbo's finger traced the lines of the map, his mind filling in details that were not marked upon the parchment, but which his memory supplied from long years of study and reflection. He saw the pattern that the markers made, the way the points of darkness seemed to converge upon a single destination, and his heart grew cold with understanding. "They are moving toward the mountain," he said quietly. "All of them. The armies of the east, the creatures of the wild lands, even the ancient things that dwell in the deep places. They all move toward Erebor." "Aye," Balin confirmed grimly. "As iron filings are drawn to the lodestone, so all the servants of darkness seem to feel the pull of something hidden beneath our halls. King Dain has set guards at every entrance, has sealed the lower deeps, but we both know that locks and guards will not avail against the enemy if he comes in his full strength." "But why tell me this?" Bilbo asked, though even as he spoke the words, he thought he knew the answer. "I am no warrior, no general to command armies. I am only an old hobbit who wants nothing more than to tend his garden and finish his book." Balin smiled then, the first warmth that had entered his expression since his arrival. "You are Bilbo Baggins, burglar of the company of Thorin Oakenshield, bearer of the ring, friend of eagles and slayer of spiders. You walked in the halls of the Elven King and spoke with Smaug the Mighty face to face. There are few in all of Middle-earth who have done what you have done, seen what you have seen." The dwarf leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And more than that, you are one whom the people remember with love rather than fear. When you speak, both dwarf and hobbit listen, for they know that your words come not from ambition or the hunger for power, but from the simple desire to see right done and evil turned aside." Outside, the wind had begun to rise, carrying with it the scent of distant places and the sound of things stirring that had long lain still. In his comfortable parlor, surrounded by the familiar things of a lifetime, Bilbo Baggins felt once again the call of the road, the pull of adventure, and the weight of choices that could not be unmade once they were taken. Far to the east, in the halls beneath the lonely mountain, the forges that had been cold since the dragon's coming now blazed with renewed life. The smiths of Erebor worked with desperate purpose, their hammers ringing against anvils that had not known such urgency since the days when Thror was king and the mountain rang with the songs of its people. But it was not only the forges of the dwarves that had awakened to sudden flame. Deep in the roots of the mountain, in chambers so far below the kingdom of Dain that few even among the miners knew of their existence, something stirred that had slept since the world was young. The heat that rose from these depths was not the clean fire of honest forge work, but something older and more terrible. The breath of fires that had burned before the sun and moon were made. Dain Ironfoot himself stood in the deepest of the lower halls, his face grim as he watched the ancient stone walls weep with condensation from the heat that pressed upward from below. The very rock was warm to the touch, and from somewhere far beneath came a sound like the beating of a vast heart, slow and patient and utterly implacable. "How long has it been thus?" he asked of Glóin, who stood beside him with sweat beading on his brow despite the chill of the mountain air above. 3 days, my king, Glóin replied, his voice tight with worry. It began the same night that the Watchers reported strange lights in the sky above Rivendell. Whatever has awakened below, it wakes in answer to something happening in the world above. The king nodded slowly, his understanding of the situation deepening with each passing hour. For too long, the dwarves of Erebor had thought themselves secure in their mountain fastness, protected by leagues of solid stone and the strength of their own arms. But now it seemed that the very foundations of their kingdom rested upon something that they had neither made nor mastered, something that belonged to an older age and darker powers. "Send word to the Deep Guard," Dain commanded. "Seal the lowest passages with iron and stone, set watches at every level, and let no one descend below the treasury without my direct command, and send swift messengers to our kinfolk in the Iron Hills. If what I fear is true, we will need every axe that can be spared." Meanwhile, hundreds of leagues to the west, another fire had awakened that defied all expectation. In the hidden forges of Rivendell, where the remaking of Andúril had begun in earnest, the flames that heated the anvils burned with colors that had not been seen since the elder days. Blue and white and gold they danced, responding not only to the bellows that fed them, but to the will of those who guided the work. Elrond himself stood at the great anvil, his hand steady despite the terrible heat that rose from the metal as it was shaped and folded again. Beside him worked the greatest smiths of his house, their faces bright with reflected flame as they labored to remake what had been broken into something greater than it had been before. The shards of Narsil lay upon the anvil like pieces of captured starlight, their edges gleaming with an inner fire that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the hammers that worked them. Each blow sent sparks flying through the air like tiny meteors, and where they fell, the very stones of the forge glowed briefly with reflected light. "The metal remembers," Elrond said softly, his voice barely audible above the ring of hammer on steel. "It remembers the hand that first shaped it, the battles it has fought, the oaths that were sworn upon its edge. We do not merely forge a new blade, we wake the old one from its slumber." Galadriel stood watching from the edge of the forge, her presence lending strength to the work even as her mind reached out across the leagues to touch the thoughts of allies and enemies alike. In her inner sight, she could see the pattern taking shape, fires awakening in the deep places, ancient powers stirring from their long rest, and at the center of it all, the blade that would either save or damn them all. "The enemy knows," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the sound of the hammers. "He feels the remaking of the sword, as surely as if we proclaimed it from every tower in Middle-earth. Even now his servants race toward us, seeking to prevent what we would accomplish." "Then we must work swiftly," Gandalf replied from where he stood channeling power into the flames. The wizard's face was drawn with effort, his staff glowing like a brand as he poured his will into the make. "The blade must be completed before they arrive, or all our efforts will have been in vain." As if to underscore his words, a tremor ran through the mountain, and from somewhere far above came the sound of horns. Not the fair horns of Rivendell, but the harsh clarions of war that spoke of enemies approaching through the high passes of the misty mountains. While the hammers rang in Rivendell and the forges blazed in Erebor, across the width of Middle-earth, other powers stirred to wakefulness. In the deep places of Isengard, where Saruman the White had delved too greedily in his hunger for knowledge and dominion, the furnaces roared with a heat that turned night into day. The wizard who had once been counted among the wise now labored to create an army that would rival the hosts of Mordor itself. The Uruk-hai that emerged from his pits were not the crude creatures that had plagued the borders of civilization for countless years. These were soldiers bred for war, tall and strong and cunning, bearing weapons forged in the fires of Orthanc, an armor that gleamed with a dull malice. In their eyes burned an intelligence that spoke of their maker's will, and in their hearts nested a hatred that knew no bounds. "Let the fools in Rivendell forge their pretty sword." Saruman spoke to the captain of his host, a creature of such terrible aspect that even the other Uruk-hai gave him wide berth. "What use is one blade, however fine its making, against 10,000 that thirst for blood? When the time comes for the final reckoning, we shall see whether steel forged in sentiment can stand against iron wrought in malice." From the Tower of Orthanc, the White Wizard looked out across the circle of Isengard and saw that it was good. His army grew by the day, his war machines stood ready to level the walls of cities, and the alliance he had forged with the Dark Lord would ensure his own dominion over the western lands. Let others dream of ancient glories and forgotten kingdoms. He would build an empire that looked only to the future, where power belonged to those with the will to seize it. But Saruman was not the only power that stirred in response to the remaking of Andúril. Far to the south, in the black land of Mordor, where the shadows lay thick upon the ground even at noon, the mouth of Sauron stood before the throne of his master and spoke words that brought both joy and rage to the heart of the Dark Lord. "The sword is being reforged, master," the lieutenant of Barad-dûr reported, his voice like the scraping of bone on stone. "Our spies in the high places have confirmed it. Even now the smiths of Rivendell work to remake what was broken, and the heir of Isildur stands ready to claim his inheritance." The eye of Sauron turned its terrible gaze upon his servant, and the lieutenant felt the weight of that attention like a mountain pressing down upon his soul. Yet he did not flinch, for he had long ago surrendered any claim to fear or hope or the other weaknesses that plagued lesser beings. "Let him forge," came the voice of the Dark Lord, speaking from the shadows that pooled around his throne like living things. "Let him forge, and let him claim, and let him think himself mighty in his newfound strength. When the hour comes for us to face each other upon the field of battle, he will learn that Isildur's line is weak, that the blood of Númenor has grown thin with the passing of years." The Dark Lord's laughter echoed through the halls of Barad-dûr, like the sound of mountains cracking, and at its touch the very stones seemed to weep tears of molten iron. "Besides," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout, "what use is a sword to one who has not the strength to wield it? The heir may claim his blade, but the hand that bears it belongs to one who has never known true kingship, who has spent his life hiding in the wild places, rather than learning to command the loyalty of men." From the depths of Mordor came the sound of marching feet, as the armies of darkness began their slow advance toward the borders of the free lands. Orcs and trolls, wargs and fell beasts, creatures of shadow and flame that had not walked openly in the world since the last alliance. All these and more answered the call of their master, eager for the war that would either establish his dominion forever or see him cast down into the void from which he had risen. In the fortress of Dol Guldur, though it had been cleansed by the White Council, shadows began to gather once more as the Nazgûl returned to claim their former stronghold. Their presence brought with it a blight that withered the very air, and the beasts of the forest fled before them like leaves scattered by a winter wind. 9 riders there were, clad in black mail and bearing weapons that had drunk deep of death. At their head rode the Witch King of Angmar, whose very name was a curse upon the lips of all who dwelt in the northern lands. They had felt the stirring of Andúril's remaking like a blade thrust into their undead hearts, and their hatred burned cold and terrible as the space between the stars. The blade was not yet drawn, but already its enemies gathered like storm clouds upon the horizon, each drawn by their own desires for revenge and dominion. The final battle would come, as it always had and always would, but this time the stakes were higher than any who had gone before could have imagined. In the hour before dawn, when the stars burned brightest in the sky above Rivendell, and the forges had reached their moment of greatest heat. The remaking of Andúril reached its culmination. The blade that emerged from the flames was no mere sword, but a weapon that seemed to capture the light of the stars themselves and hold it captive in steel, forged from the will of those who refused to surrender to darkness. Aragorn stood before the anvil as Elrond lifted the completed blade with tongs that glowed red from the heat. Even in the dim light of the forge, Andúril blazed with an inner fire that made the very air around it shimmer. Along its fuller ran letters in the ancient script of Westerness, spelling out the name that would strike fear into the hearts of orcs and bring hope to all who fought for freedom. Andúril, Flame of the West. "Take up your inheritance, son of Arathorn," Elrond said formally, his voice carrying the weight of all the ages that had passed since the sword was first forged. "Take up the blade of your fathers, and with it the burden that your bloodline has carried through all the long years of exile." With hands that trembled only slightly, Aragorn grasped the hilt of the reborn sword. The moment his fingers closed upon the grip, a change came over him that all present could see. The weariness of his long years in the wild seemed to fall away like a discarded cloak, and in its place stood one who looked every inch a king, tall and proud and terrible in his righteousness. The blade sang as he lifted it, a sound like silver bells ringing across still water. And where its light fell, the shadows retreated as though they had been struck with physical force. In that moment, Aragorn was no longer Strider the Ranger, wanderer of the wild paths. He was Elessar, the Elfstone, Telcontar, the Strider transformed, rightful king of Gondor and Arnor, heir of Isildur the Tall. "I am the king," he said simply, and though he spoke the words quietly, they rang through the forge like a bell tolling the end of one age and the beginning of another. "I am the king, and I will no longer hide from what that means." But even as he spoke the words that reclaimed his heritage, the sound of battle drew closer to the hidden valley. From the high passes came the clash of steel on steel and the cries of those who fought and died in the darkness. The servants of the enemy had found the roads to Rivendell at last, and they pressed forward with desperate urgency, knowing that they had come almost too late to prevent what they had been sent to stop. Glorfindel entered the forge at a run, his fair face grim with news of desperate import. "They come, my lord," he reported to Elrond. "Uruk high out of Isengard, orcs from the misty mountains, and other things that should not walk beneath the stars. Our warriors hold the passes for now, but their numbers are great, and they fight with the fury of those who know they face their last chance." "How long?" Aragorn asked, though his eyes never left the blade that blazed in his hands. "An hour, perhaps two, if our people can hold the inner defenses, but no longer. Their will is too strong, their need too great. They will break through, or die in the attempt." Aragorn nodded slowly, accepting the reality of their situation with the calm that comes to those who have finally stopped running from their destiny. "Then we must be ready to meet them. The blade is forged, the king has claimed his inheritance, and now we shall see whether that is enough to turn the tide of this long war." He turned to face the assembled company, Elrond, Gandalf, Galadriel, and all the others who had labored to bring this moment to pass. In his eyes burned a light that was not entirely of this world, the light of one who had accepted fully the weight of his calling and found that he was strong enough to bear it. "The kingdom is reclaimed," he said, raising Andúril so that its light fell upon all their faces. "Not the kingdom of stone and mortar, of borders drawn upon maps, but the kingdom of the heart, the realm of those who choose to stand against the darkness, no matter how great the cost." Outside, the sound of battle grew louder, and the very walls of Rivendell seemed to shudder under the assault of forces that sought to tear down all that had been built through love and hope and the patient work of centuries. But within the forge, surrounded by the tools of creation and the warmth of fires, that burned for protection rather than destruction. There was only the calm that comes before the storm, and the certainty that whatever else might happen, this moment, this claiming of destiny, would echo through all the ages yet to come. Yet even as Andúril blazed with newborn fire and Aragorn stepped into his inheritance as king, there stirred in the depths of Middle-earth something that neither sword nor crown could touch. Far from the halls of Rivendell, in the slow waters of the Anduin, where the current ran deep and dark between walls of ancient stone, something that had slept for decades began to dream restless dreams. The One Ring lay where it had fallen from Isildur's hand in the hour of his death, buried beneath silt and river stones, wrapped in the darkness of deep water. For long years it had been content to wait, patient as only the creations of the Dark Lord could be patient, knowing that time itself was its ally and that all things would come to pass according to the will of its maker. But now, as the blade that had cut it from Sauron's hand was made whole once more, the ring felt a stirring that was like the first tremor before an earthquake. The song of the reforged steel called to it across the leagues, and it began to sing in answer, not with voice or music, but with a longing that reached out through the water and the stone and the very air itself. In the Shire, where Bilbo Baggins had lived in peace for so many years, there was another ring that had once been fair to look upon, but which now seemed to weigh heavy upon the hand that bore it. It was but a simple band of gold, unremarkable to any who did not know its true nature. Yet, as the One Ring stirred in its watery grave, this lesser ring began to burn upon his finger with a heat that spoke of kinship and calling. Bilbo woke from troubled sleep to find his hand clenched in a fist, the ring pressing against his palm with such intensity that it seemed it might brand his flesh. In his dreams he had walked again upon the shores of a dark river, and from its depths had come a voice that whispered his name with longing and hunger and terrible need. "Precious," the voice had said, and though he had never heard it before, something in his heart recognized it as surely as a child knows its mother's call. Precious comes to us at last. Precious brings us home. But it was not only in the Shire that the ring's stirring was felt. In the depths of the misty mountains, where dark tunnels wound through stone that had been carved by neither dwarf nor orc, there moved a creature that had once been something like a hobbit, but which had been twisted by long years of hatred and desire into something barely recognizable as having once been alive. Gollum crept through passages that few other creatures knew, his pale eyes gleaming in the darkness as he felt the call that sang in his very bones. The ring that he had called precious for so many years, the ring that had been stolen from him by the cursed Baggins, was stirring at last. It was waking, and it was calling, and soon, oh so very soon, it would come back to its proper master. "We feels it, precious," he whispered to himself as he scuttled through the darkness like some pale spider. "We feels it waking, calling to us from the dark waters. Soon, precious, soon we comes to takes you home. Soon the nasty hobbits pays for what they stoles from us." Far to the east, in the tower of Barad-dûr, where the eye of Sauron gazed out across his dominions, the Dark Lord felt the stirring of his greatest creation and laughed with a sound like the breaking of the world. For too long the ring had lain hidden, its power scattered and diffused by distance, and the flowing water that held it. But now it woke, and with its waking came the certainty that the final age was at hand. "Let them forge their swords," he whispered to the darkness that surrounded him. "Let them crown their kings and gather their armies and speak brave words of hope and defiance. When my ring returns to me at last, when I put it upon my finger and speak the words that will bind all things to my will, they will learn that all their courage was but vanity, all their hope but the flickering of candles before the storm." The stirring of the ring sent ripples through the very fabric of Middle-earth, touching the dreams of elves and men, of dwarves and hobbits, of all who had the sight to see beyond the surface of things. Some felt it as a chill upon the wind, others as a shadow that fell across their thoughts. But all who felt it knew, in the depths of their hearts, that something fundamental had changed, that the world stood now upon the edge of a precipice from which there could be no return. In Rivendell, as Aragorn raised Andúril in triumph, and the forces of darkness pressed closer to the hidden valley, Gandalf suddenly stiffened, his hand tightening upon his staff until his knuckles showed white. He alone among those present understood fully what was happening, for he alone carried the knowledge of the ring's true nature and the terrible power that would be unleashed when it finally returned to its master's hand. "It stirs," he whispered, and though his words were barely audible, they carried the weight of prophecy. The One Ring stirs in its slumber, and its dreams reach out to touch the world. The final game begins now, whether we will it or not. Even as Gandalf spoke these words of warning, a strange silence began to fall upon the battle that raged beyond the borders of Rivendell. The clash of steel upon steel grew distant, the cries of warriors faded to whispers, and the harsh clarions of war fell quiet, one by one. In the forge where Andúril blazed with newborn light, those who had labored to create it exchanged glances of wonder and growing unease. "They withdraw," Glorfindel reported, returning from the ramparts with news that defied all expectation. "The armies of darkness, they pull back from our borders as though called by some greater summons. The orcs of the mountains retreat into their tunnels, the Uruk-hai of Saruman march south toward Isengard, and even the fell creatures of the air have turned away from our valley." Aragorn frowned, his hand still gripping the hilt of the reforged sword. "This makes no sense. They came with such urgency, pressed our defenses with such fury. Why would they abandon their assault now, when victory might have been within their grasp?" But Gandalf's expression was grave, his understanding of the enemy's nature deeper than that of any other present. "Because they have felt what we have felt," he said slowly. "The stirring of the ring has changed the very nature of their mission. No longer do they seek merely to prevent the sword's remaking. Now they race to be present when their master reclaims his greatest creation." Galadriel nodded, her fair face shadowed with the weight of foresight. The battle for Rivendell was but a skirmish in a war that will soon encompass all of Middle-earth. Our enemies withdraw not in defeat, but in preparation for a conflict beside which this night's work will seem as nothing. From the high windows of the house, they could see the proof of her words. Across the dark landscape, moving like rivers of shadow beneath the stars, the armies of darkness flowed away from Rivendell toward destinations known only to their masters. Some moved east toward the borders of Mordor, others south toward the White Tower of Saruman, but all moved with purpose that spoke of orders received and strategies set in motion. The cleansing of Dol Guldur was but a temporary victory, Elrond said quietly, his voice heavy with the knowledge of one who had lived through too many cycles of hope and despair. "The shadow flees, but it does not die. It gathers in other places, takes new forms, finds new servants to do its will. What we drove out of the fortress in Mirkwood has gone to ground elsewhere, and there it will fester and grow strong until the hour of its returning." The withdrawal of the enemy forces brought no relief to those who watched from the walls of Rivendell, for they understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The real war was yet to come, and when it arrived, it would bring with it such devastation as Middle-earth had not seen since the last alliance marched to the very gates of Mordor. "Where will they strike first?" Aragorn asked, though he dreaded to hear the answer. "Wherever the ring calls to them," Gandalf replied. "It stirs now in the depths of Anduin, but it will not remain there long. Something will come to claim it, some creature driven by hunger and desperate need, or perhaps some servant of the enemy sent to retrieve what was lost." And when that happens, when the ring begins to move toward its master once more, then the race will truly begin. Outside, the last of the enemy forces vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only the silence of a land that holds its breath before the storm. In that silence, those who remained in Rivendell could feel the weight of destiny settling upon them like a cloak of lead. The sword was forged, the king had claimed his inheritance, but the greatest trial still lay ahead. "We must send word to all who might stand with us," Aragorn said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had finally accepted the full weight of his calling. "To the Rohirrim, to the people of Gondor, to the dwarves of the mountains and the elves of the woodland realm. All must know that the final age has come, and that the choice they make in the days ahead will determine the fate of all the free peoples of Middle-earth. And we must watch," Galadriel added, her voice soft but implacable. "Watch and wait and prepare, for when the ring begins to move, we must be ready to act. The enemy withdraws now, but he will return, and when he does, he will come with all the power at his command. Our only hope lies in being prepared for that hour, in gathering our strength while he gathers his." As the first light of dawn began to touch the peaks of the misty mountains, painting them gold and rose against the dark sky, those who had labored through the night to forge Andúril stood together and looked out upon a world that had been forever changed. The sword was made, the king was crowned, but the shadow that fled before them was not destroyed, only scattered, like seeds upon the wind, waiting for the right season to take root and grow once more. In the days that followed the forging of Andúril, as the news of the sword's remaking spread like ripples across the still waters of a pond, there came to Rivendell tales from the far corners of Middle-earth that spoke of changes both wondrous and terrible. From the Shire came word that Bilbo Baggins had set forth once more upon the road, bearing messages to the halls of Erebor and speaking words that stirred the hearts of those who heard them. From the north came tidings that the Nazgûl had indeed returned to Dol Guldur, but that their presence there was restless, as though they waited for some sign or summons that had not yet come. But it was from the deep places of the world that the strangest news arrived. Reports from miners and delvers, from those who worked in the roots of mountains and the foundations of the earth, that something moved in the darkness below. Not orcs or goblins, for these creatures were known and their ways understood, but something older and more patient, something that had lain sleeping since the world was young, and now stirred to wakefulness, as though called by a voice that only it could hear. Aragorn stood once more upon the high terrace of Elrond's house, but now Andúril hung at his side, its presence a constant reminder of the weight he had accepted and the path that lay before him. The sword seemed lighter than its predecessor had been, yet somehow more substantial, as though it had been forged not merely from steel and fire, but from hope itself given physical form. "The people begin to remember," Gandalf said, joining him at the stone rail. The wizard looked older than he had before the night of the forging, as though the effort of channeling power into the blade's creation had cost him something that could not easily be replaced. Yet his eyes still burned with the inner fire that marked him as one of the Istari, and his voice carried the authority of one who had walked in the halls of the Valar. "Remember what?" Aragorn asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "That there were once kings in Gondor and Arnor, that the blood of Númenor still flows in the veins of those who would defend rather than conquer, who would serve rather than rule. Word of Andúril's remaking has reached Minas Tirith, and even Denethor's pride cannot entirely suppress the whispers that speak of the return of the king." They stood in companionable silence for a time, watching as the sun climbed higher in the eastern sky, and the mist that had clung to the valley began to burn away. In that growing light, Rivendell looked much as it always had, timeless and peaceful, a refuge from the troubles of a world that seemed always poised on the edge of war. Yet both men knew that this peace was an illusion, a moment of calm before storms that would test the strength of all who lived in Middle-earth. "I have been thinking," Aragorn said at last, "of what Isildur showed me in the vault, of the choices that lie ahead, and the price that must be paid for victory, if victory is even possible." "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. That kingship is not about the power to command, but the strength to serve, and that sometimes the greatest victory requires the sacrifice of the very thing one fights to protect." Gandalf nodded slowly. "You speak with the wisdom of one who has looked into the heart of darkness and not been consumed by it. That wisdom will serve you well in the trials to come, for I fear they will test more than your sword arm." From somewhere in the distance came the sound of horns, not the harsh clarions of war, but the clear, sweet notes that spoke of messengers arriving with news from friendly lands. Both men turned toward the sound, knowing that whatever word these riders brought would mark another step along the path that led inexorably toward the final confrontation between light and shadow. "The wheel turns," Gandalf murmured, his hand tightening upon his staff. "The age of the elves draws to its close, and the age of men begins. What they will make of their inheritance remains to be seen, but at least now they will face the future with a king to lead them and a sword to light their way." Aragorn drew Andúril from its sheath, and the blade caught the morning light and threw it back, transformed, brighter and cleaner than the sun itself. In that radiance, both men could see reflected not just the present moment, but glimpses of a future that might yet be, a future where the free peoples of Middle-earth stood together against the darkness, where courage and hope proved stronger than fear and despair, where small hands and brave hearts accomplished what armies and wizards could not. "Hope," Aragorn said simply, raising the sword so that its light fell upon the road that led away from Rivendell toward the wider world. "Hope, kindled in the forge and carried forth upon the wind. Whatever darkness may come, whatever trials await, that at least will endure." And in the growing light of the morning, with Andúril blazing in his hand like a star brought down to earth, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, stepped forward into his destiny. No longer the ranger who had wandered nameless in the wild, but Elisar the Elfstone, rightful king of Gondor and Arnor, bearer of the flame of the West, ready at last to claim the throne that had waited so long for his return. The tale was not ended, for the greatest chapters were yet to be written. But the foundation had been laid, the sword had been forged, and hope had been rekindled in a world that had almost forgotten what it meant to dream of dawn. Thus ends the tale of the forging of Andúril, though the greater story of which it formed a part would echo through all the ages of Middle-earth, until the very ending of the world.